Let's move on with this idea of disaster risk concept and how it evolved. Already we talked about it through this Kobe and the other conference, which was what? Yokohama and Kobe. So the evolution of ideas concerning disaster risk. Although the global political commitment to the outcome of the Second World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction was much greater and more explicit, the actual differences in ideas between Yokohama and Hyogo conferences are even less pronounced than between the 4 World Conferences on Sustainable Development presented earlier. So they basically added epsilon to the details. The development of the Hyogo Declaration and Framework was based on a review of the implementation of the Yokohama documents, addressing the identified challenges mainly by re-emphasizing the contents and making them even more explicit. The focus on natural disaster reduction was conceptually abandoned for a focus on disaster risk reduction, with a number of related terminological changes, but otherwise much of the content remained the same, as we'll see in this figure next. However, there are a number of other developments that are worth mentioning. Okay, but let me just summarize. To summarize, the contemporary view of the international community is that disaster risk is a main challenge for sustainable development, and that disaster risk largely is a result of failed development. Managing risk is, in other words, a requisite for sustainable development and must be integrated along with the economic development, social development, and environmental protection. In a broader context, that should also synergize with resilience building, nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement, and national adaptation plans that are required under Paris Agreement as well. And of course, these three that are always a higher economic development and social development, especially the economic development, tends to be the highest priority for most countries, including the rich countries. Hence, they may kick aside the sustainable development ideas. But disaster risk is something else. So even though US has had a lot of battles with denial of climate change and so on, it cannot ignore the climate impacts in terms of disasters, the droughts in the west, the wildfires all over, floods and extreme events in the east, sea level rise and impacts in the Gulf of Mexico, and so on. So, tornadoes, hurricanes on top as well. And there, sustainable development is not necessarily a framework needed. You just can go after disaster risks, risk management, risk preventions, and recovery. The details are, of course, in the devil is, of course, in the details, in the sense that if you want to really do disaster risk management, you have to plan for resilience, because your infrastructure and your building codes, everything has energy infrastructure, everything has to be resilient to disasters, not only now but in the coming years and decades. So you will need again risk information, which is not going to be independent of climate and extremes again, but this risk information has to be provided by the climate community again, instead of just saying we have to do risk informed decisions and so on, right? So it's kind of interesting, complicated, but yet a fun scientific and intellectual challenge that we should take up much more seriously. So the world cloud of the Yokohama message and the Yokohama strategy and plan of action from 1994 and of the Hyogo Declaration and the Hyogo Framework for Action from 2005 constructed in Wordle. So 1994 had disaster, of course, at the center. 2005 still has the same thing. Natural and reduction came up here, whereas risk reduction comes up here, and of course you have development countries, disasters, decade, international here. So you also have development and international here. So before I move on to boundaries for sustainability, I want to pause here for a second and add some words on the Sendai framework, which has happened after this book came out. So let me pause and come back with the addition of the Sendai framework for disaster risk management. Okay? So sorry about that. I should have planned that before, but somehow it skipped my mind, but no harm done. Here we are continuing with the what happened here. Can I go to the am I recording? Yes. So let me make sure that I am recording. Looks funny over there. Yeah, skin, everything is fine. I suddenly get confused. This is a fairly straightforward thing. I use Panopto, but anyway. Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015 to 2030, which builds on what we already looked at, Yokohama, Kobe, and the Hyobo Declaration. Preamble here. A nice infographic provided by them. Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015 to 2030 was adapted at the 3rd United Nations World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, held from 14 to 18 March 2015 in Sendai, Miyagi, Japan, which represented a unique opportunity for countries, so came after the book was published, to adopt a concise, focused, forward-looking, action-oriented post-2015 framework for disaster risk reduction, to complete the assessment and review of the implementation of the Hyogo Framework for Action 2005 to 2015, so a follow-up plan, building resilience of nations and communities to disasters, to consider the experience gained through the regional and national strategies, institutions, and plans for disaster risk reduction and their recommendations, as well as relevant regional agreements for the implementation of the Hyogo Framework for Action, to identify modalities of cooperation based on commitments to implement a post-2015 framework for disaster risk reduction, to determine modalities for the periodic review of the implementation of a post-2015 framework for disaster risk reduction. Okay, so the chart of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015 to 2030, the scope and purpose go like this. The present framework will apply to the risk of small-scale and large-scale, frequent and infrequent, sudden and slow onset disasters. So we call them chronic and acute stressors caused by natural or man-made hazards, as well as related environmental, technological and biological hazards and risks. Again, the umbrella is trying to include everything, but it has priorities and action plans as well. It aims to guide the multi-hazard management of disaster risk in development at all levels, as well as within and across all sectors. Expected outcome: the substantial reduction of disaster risk and losses in lives, livelihoods and health, and in the economic, physical, social, cultural and environmental assets of persons, businesses, communities and countries. Goal: prevent new and reduce existing disaster risk through the implementation of integrated and inclusive economic, structural, legal, social, health, cultural, educational, environmental, technological, political, and institutional measures that prevent and reduce hazard exposure and vulnerability to disaster, increase preparedness for response and recovery, and thus strengthen resilience. So if you think about a country like Philippines or Pakistan, when massive floods hit them, there is not much they can do to prevent the floods other than to prepare the land use and use early warnings to alleviate the floods in many cases, but the amount of extreme rain that falls is not something they can do much about. So adaptation then becomes critical as mitigation efforts at the global scale keep going. So disaster risk reduction is very much a local thing. And the question is, having a global framework, does it bring expertise, technological help and financing, loss and damage, etc. to help countries that are getting hammered. So then the targets: substantially reduce global disaster mortality by 2030, aiming to lower average per 100,000 global mortality between 2020 and 2030 compared to what happened during 2005 to 2015. So we won't talk about how large the mortality is, because if you get into the game of comparing total number of deaths from natural disasters versus other causes like cardiovascular diseases, then you will be disappointed that natural disasters actually amount to less than 1% of the total deaths, but they get a lot of attention because of the shocking images that come out after the disasters. Substantially reduce the number of affected people globally by 2030, aiming to lower the average global figure by per 100,000 between 2020-2030 again compared to the previous decade. Reduce direct disaster economic loss in relation to the gross domestic product by 2030, so GDP loss should be reduced. Substantially reduce disaster damage to critical infrastructure and disruption of basic services, among them health and educational facilities, including through developing their resilience by 2030. So this is where the idea of going beyond coping to building resilience comes in. Requires not only planning strategies, information, but mainstreaming these into fiscal policies and financing in a sustainable way, which is anything but trivial. Substantially increase the number of countries with national and local disaster risk reduction strategies by 2020. I'm recording this in 2024. I can speak for India that it has done very well, but how do the global numbers do? We have to look that up. Substantially enhance international cooperation to developing countries through adequate and sustainable support to complement their national actions for implementation of this framework by 2030. I have podcasts on loss and damage history and where we are, so you can look those up, but this relates to that, the concept of loss and damage, or just pitch it as disaster risk help, disaster risk management assistance to the developing world. Substantially increase the availability and access to multi-hazard early warning systems and disaster risk information and assessments to people by 2030. So here again, countries like India, let's say, who are investing a lot on early warnings, can help, and they do help other countries, but of course geopolitical tensions and other sensitivities and distrust can play into this. So international action and cooperation can begin to work on these despite the other issues of economic tensions or defense tensions, national security issues, and so on, because these are shared destinies. The Indian subcontinent with India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, Burma, Bhutan, these are very connected together. Bangladesh is a, big target for natural disasters. So what are the priorities for action? There is a need for focused action within and across sectors by states at local, national, regional, and global levels in the following 4 priority areas. Priority 1, understanding disaster risk. Disaster risk management needs to be based on an understanding of disaster risk in all its dimensions of vulnerability, capacity, exposure of persons and assets, hazard characteristics, and environment. Priority 2, strengthening disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk. I'll go ahead and read these even though it takes a little time. Disaster risk governance at the national, regional, and global levels is vital to the management of disaster risk reduction in all sectors and ensuring the coherence of national and local frameworks of laws, regulations, and public policies that, by defining roles and responsibilities, guide, encourage, and incentivize the public and private sectors to take action and address disaster risk. I've discussed a lot in the adaptation course the idea of incentivizing people and firms to adapt to climate risks, but here we are talking about also engaging them in disaster risk reduction, including reducing their own exposure despite the moral hazards like insurance that may allow them to think it's okay to live in high-risk areas. Priority area 3 Investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience, so beyond coping. Public and private investment in disaster risk prevention and reduction through structural and non-structural measures are essential to enhance the economic, social health and cultural resilience of persons, communities, countries and their assets, as well as the environment. These can be drivers of innovation, growth and job creation. Such measures are cost-effective and instrumental to save lives, prevent and reduce losses, and ensure effective recovery and rehabilitation. Managing disasters is expensive, but building in resilience can be sometimes much cheaper. So that automatically reduces the risk and reduces the cost of management, enhances the speed of recovery, and of course reduces loss of lives and property, livelihoods and so on. Priority area 4, enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and to build back better in recovery, rehabilitation and reconstruction. I've discussed this a lot in adaptation as well. Experience indicates that disaster preparedness needs to be strengthened for more effective response and ensure capacities are in place for effective recovery. Disasters have also demonstrated that the recovery, rehabilitation and reconstruction phase, which needs to be prepared ahead of the disaster, is an opportunity to build back better through integrating disaster risk reduction measures. Women and persons with disabilities should publicly lead and promote gender equitable and universally acceptable approaches during the response and reconstruction phase. So disaster destruction can bring an opportunity to build back better for resilience and so on. Guiding principles: primary responsibility of states to prevent and reduce disaster risk, including through cooperation, of course. Shared responsibility between central government and national authorities. So we are corresponding to these priorities here, but you go back and map those. Protection of persons and their assets while promoting and protecting all human rights, including the right to development. Engagement from all of society, full engagement of all institutions of an executive and legislative nature at national and local levels. Empowerment of local authorities and communities through resources, incentives and decision-making responsibilities as appropriate. Decision-making to be inclusive and risk-informed while using a multi-hazard approach. Coherence of disaster risk reduction and sustainable development policies, plans, practices and mechanisms across different sectors. Accounting of local specific characteristics of disaster risks when determining measures to reduce risk. Addressing underlying risk factors cost effectively through investment versus relying primarily on post-disaster response and recovery. Build back better for preventing the creation of and reducing existing disaster risk. The quality of global partnership and international cooperation to be effective, meaningful and strong. So what can Global South do to make this happen from the Global North perspective? Support from developed countries and partners to developing countries to be tailored according to needs and priorities as identified by the Global South itself. These are not easy, but nonetheless these are essential. Again, the big motivation can come from remembering that global economies are now very tightly coupled together. It's a bit longish, but it's okay. See you in the next podcast on boundaries of our sustainability, which goes into planetary boundaries. I will come back and discuss.